The Effect of Overlearning on Retention by C. F. Krueger, Psychological Laboratory, University of Chicago. Recorded by Leon Harvey for LibriVox.org. This experiment is concerned with the following problems. 1. As the degree of learning is varied from 100% to 200%, will the degree of retention vary proportionally, i.e., will 50% overlearning increase the amount retained by 50%, or by some other proportion? 2. Will the relation between the degree of retention and the degree of learning vary with the interval between learning and recall? For example, if 50% overlearning increases retention by 40% after a one-day interval, will this latter percentage increase or decrease with the length of the interval? La obtained results bearing upon these problems. The subjects, college students, and one instructor memorized series of nonsense syllables of 12 each. The lists were presented on a memory drum, each word being exposed for 2 seconds. Only one degree of overlearning was used, namely 150% learning. The intervals between learning and recall were 4 hours, 1 day, and 2 days. Retention was tested by the methods of unaided written reproduction, recognition, and reconstruction. The increase of retention was always less than the degree of overlearning. The ratio of retentive increase to the degree of overlearning decreases with the interval, and in some cases overlearning even proved detrimental. For example, when retention was measured by written reproduction, the 4-hour interval showed an increase of 17.1%, while a one-day interval gave an actual decrease of 7.1%, and the 2-day interval showed a decrease of 10.6%. The results were approximately the same for all three methods of measuring retention. The present experiment was designed to supplement and to extend Lull's work by employing 2 degrees of overlearning and a wider range of intervals. Our experimental conditions differ from Lull's in the following respects. Instead of a series of 12 nonsense syllables, we used lists of 12 monosyllabic nouns. We had 2 degrees of overlearning, 50% and 100%. The range of intervals in our experiment was 1, 2, 4, 7, 14, and 28 days. Retention was tested 1. By anticipatory verbal recall and 2. By the saving method. A list of words was presented by means of a memory drum at the rate of 2 seconds per word. S was permitted to use any method of memorizing except that of writing down the words. The usual anticipatory method, verbal recall, was employed to test the degree of learning, but the anticipatory test was given in alternate trials instead of in every trial, as is usual. By 100% learning, we mean the degree or stage of perfection at which S was first able to anticipate correctly all the words in the list in a single presentation. To obtain 50% overlearning, the presentations were continued until the number was increased by 1/2 of the number of trials required for the 100% degree of mastery, and 100% overlearning was given twice the number of trials necessary just to learn a list. If, for example, 10 trials were needed to learn a list, 100%, 5 more was the number arbitrarily set for 50% overlearning. If 12 trials were necessary, 6 more were added, etc. Only one new list was learned on any one day. Different groups of subjects were utilized for the various intervals, but the lists employed were the same throughout. For each interval, the same group was used for the 3 degrees of learning. 2 methods were employed to eliminate the possibility that the difference between the 3 learning and retention scores might be due to practice. 1. All subjects were first required to memorize 4 practice lists before being tested. 2. 1/2 took the 3 conditions in the order of 100%, 150%, and 200% learning, while the other half took in the reverse order of 200%, 150%, and 100% learning. To avoid the possibility that the differences in retention were due to differences in the difficulty of the lists, each of 20 subjects learned a different list for a given degree of mastery. Thus, the average for each condition was based upon the retention scores for 20 lists. There was one exception. For each degree of learning, with a one-day interval, the averages were computed from 40 retention scores, or 20 scores from each of the 20 lists. After the specified interval, the subjects were required to relearn the lists up to a 100% stage of mastery. The subjects were tested by the anticipatory method of verbal recall on the odd-numbered trials. This gave us two measures of retention. 1. The number of words correctly anticipated on the first presentation, and 2. The percentage of saving based upon learning and relearn scores. Table 1 is displayed on the page, average number of trials to learn and relearn a list. Table 1 is found for each of the 18 conditions. The average number of trials necessary, 1 to learn and 2 to relearn a list. Column 3 states the average number of trials necessary to memorize a list to the specific degrees of learning. The fourth column gives the average number of trials required to attain a 100% degree of learning. The seventh column records the average number of trials required to relearn each list. All averages are based on 20 measures, with the exception of those for the one-day interval, which are based upon 40 scores. The other columns give the measures of variability, such as the SDs and PEs, for each average. By inspection, it may be seen that the learning scores, based upon 100% learning, were approximately the same for the 18 conditions. Thus, any differences in the amounts retained cannot be accounted for by differences in the learning scores. The retention scores are given in tables 2 and 3. The verbal recall scores, which are found in the third column of table 2, represent the average number of words recalled for each condition. In the next two columns of the same table are the standard deviations and probability events for the corresponding averages. The last two columns give the ratio of the difference between the two obtained means to the probability event difference. All values above 4 indicate a statistically significant difference between the two respective averages. Table 2 is displayed on the previous page. Average verbal recall score and reliability of the difference between obtained averages. Table 3 is displayed on the following page. Average percentage retained as measured by the saving method. Table 3 states the average retention scores for all conditions as derived by the saving method. These values were computed by the usual formula from the 100% degree of learning and the relearning scores of Table 1. Column 3 gives the average percentage retained for each degree of learning and for the various intervals. The standard deviations and probability events of these averages are in the next two columns. The last two columns give the ratio of the difference between the respective means to the probability event difference. The retention scores of tables 2 and 3 show that for every interval the highest amount retained was for 100% overlearning, while 100% learning always gave the least score. The ratios of the differences between two obtained means to their probability events difference express a statistically valid difference between the two respective retention scores without a single exception. In order to discover whether the relation between the degree of learning and the degree of retention varies with the interval between learning and recall, we computed the ratios between the retention scores for 100% learning and 150% learning, and the ratios of retention scores for 150% learning and 200% learning. The respective degrees of learning stand in the ratios of 1 to 1.5 and 1 to 1.33. By dividing the retention scores for each interval by the retention scores for the lesser degree of learning, we get the corresponding ratios of retention. For example, according to Table 2, the retention scores for 100% and 150% learning for the one-day interval stand in the ratio of 3.10 to 4.60, and the retention scores for 150% and 200% learning are in the ratio of 4.60 to 5.83. By dividing the first ratio by 3.10 and the second ratio by 4.60, the retention scores for the lesser degree of learning, we obtain the simplified ratios of 1 to 1.48 and 1 to 1.27. These ratios mean that an increase of learning from 100% to 150% gave a corresponding increase in retention of 48%, while increased learning by an additional 33.33%, from 150% to 200%, increased retention only by 27%. Tables 4 and 6 give the two series of ratios for the verbal recall scores. By the same procedure, we computed the ratios of retention for the scores derived by the saving method. These ratios are found in tables 5 and 7. To illustrate the relative efficiency of overlearning for the various intervals, we see that, as stated in Table 4, 50% overlearning increased retention, 48% for the 1-day interval, 100% for the 2-day interval, 310% for the 4-day interval, 550% for the 7-day interval, etc. The infinity score for 150% learning with a 28-day interval was due to the zero record for 100% learning. On the previous page, Table 4 is displayed. Ratio degree of learning and corresponding ratios for retention for 100% and 150% learning. Table 5, ratio of degree of learning and corresponding ratios for retention for 100% and 150% learning. Table 6, ratio of degree of learning and corresponding ratios of retention for 150% and 200% learning. Table 7, ratio of degree of learning and corresponding ratios of retention for 100% and 150% learning. From tables 4, 5, 6, and 7, we may conclude that 1. As the degree of learning was increased from 100% to 150%, the corresponding increase in retention for the 1-day interval was approximately the same, and that this ratio increased rapidly as the length of the interval between learning and recall was extended. 2. As the degree of learning was increased from 150% to 200%, or by an additional 33 1/3%, the corresponding increase in retention was usually less, and this proportion did not vary consistently with the length of the interval. Our results thus directly contradict those of La. This divergency of results may be due to the differences in the conditions, difference in material, method of measurement, and length of the interval employed. Our results suggest that the third factor may be partially responsible. A certain degree of overlearning, at least 50%, is highly economical from the standpoint of retention for intervals of 2 to 28 days, and the larger the interval, the greater is the economy. Further increases of overlearning, however, prove to be uneconomical for most intervals. Manuscript received June 20, 1928. End of The Effect of Overlearning on Retention by C. F. Krueger.